now that we have Unity set up, ready to work with, let's start putting our game together. So over here in the scene by default, you can see there's already a camera, and that's pretty much the only object we have in there. So this camera and then the area that it looks at. And an important thing to note is we're working with a 2D game here, so we only really need the XY axis. But over here under the inspector, which currently tells us everything about the camera, you can see under position, the X and Y is centered, but the Z is -10. So that is how we can set things up in layers. So the positive numbers move away from us. So let's put a background to work with. So from this asset pack, I'll go in here, and there's a whole lot of different options. You can see backgrounds, characters, effects. I think under environments, yeah, so here's a few of them. I'm going this Gothic folder, and there's some doors and little props, and I'm just going to drag in this background here. You can see where this scene was already showing was just showing the camera area, but now it's at we just see a little bitty picture of our scene. So when something's there, if you select in the hierarchy and then bring your mouse over the scene area and push F, it will zoom out to focus on what you're looking at and show that. So there's a room for us to work with. It looks fairly centered. That'll give us a good starting point. And over here we have information about where the positions are located. I'll just set all those to 0. And like I said, the Z-axis tells what's in front of the other things. And we want all of our characters to be in front of that background room. So I'm going to set that at maybe 1 or 2, just back a little bit. So then the camera is set at -10, so it's really close to us. The background is set at 1 or some positive number, so it's far away. And then any characters, we can just slide in right between them. So I come up to this characters tab. There's a few different ones. This asset pack I downloaded had a whole lot of things, but I'm going to go in this folder. And here's a few different characters to work with. I'm just going to choose one at random and just click on it and drag it over to the scene to get started. So that'll be our character. And since that's the one we'll be moving to keep track of it, I'm going to go ahead and rename it. So if I right click on it over here in the hierarchy and rename that as player. That way we can easily refer to it. And then over here we see some information about it in the inspector. So transform, that is the attributes of the object that tell us the position, the X, Y, and Z spot where it's located. And just watch the Z because the camera's at -10 and the room is at a +1. So we just want to make sure all the characters are between those two things. How it's rotated, what scale factor is it, information about the sprite, and then we can add more components as we need them, which we will need quite a few soon. So that gives us a player standing in our room. Kind of a starting point, but now we want that player to do something. I guess the first thing we might want it to do is just move around. So that brings us over to the Bolt visual scripting, which we put together down here in the graph. So some quick terminology. We'll have two main terms we use here. So one is going to be units and the other one is nodes. And we need to find those. Those are the symbols that represent what we want it to do. So to start with, if you right click here on the graph, you'll notice it's not doing anything. That's because we haven't actually created a graph yet. So what we need to do is over here in our assets folder, and create a new folder here. So over here in the assets, just right click Come up to create, and we'll put all the scripts together in a folder to keep them organized. So a folder, and I'll call it macros. That's the standard term we use. Instead of scripts written in C#, we're going to use macros assembled using Bolt. So in that folder, we're ready to put our first graph together, or our first macro. So we'll go to create, and you'll see on this menu that pops up, one of the options is Bolt, and we have two options, either a flow macro or a state macro. So a flow macro tells us how the objects move from one state of the game to the next state. Or a state macro tells us what the next state of the game the object needs to be in. Flow macros are a little more intuitive to start with, because we look at the position of all the objects in the game and what do they have to do in order to get to the next state. How do they flow as the game progresses? So we'll do all flow macros to start with here. And that generated a new flow macro, and notice the graph changed colors and tells us what it is now. So I'm going to call this player control. So then everything that we need for the player will be assembled on this graph. And then we need to link it to the player. So if we come up here to the hierarchy, then select player, and over here in the inspector window we have some stuff. We have the transform, so the information about the player's position, rotation, all of that. Some information about the sprite, the image we're looking at. But there's no place to put in a macro, so we need to create that component in the player to link our Bolt visual script to that player to tell it what to do. So we'll go to add component, and right off the bat you have this big thing to search through, but there's a find feature, so we can just look for what we want. We want a flow machine. So if you start typing flow, the word flow machine should pop up. When we select that, you can see that's now an attribute of our player object, and the source is going to be one of our macros, which is the visual Bolt scripts and graphs we put together. We call them macros. Some other things. The one we need to worry about is right here. What macro do we want to run? Right now it says none. So to set that, we can just come over here to the project window, click on that, and drag it right over to that spot and drop it in there. So now this graph is affiliated with the player. So anything we put in here, the player is going to carry that stuff out. And we're ready to put our script together. So there are two events that we need to worry about with every one of our graphs. And if we right click, we'll bring up what's called the fuzzy finder. This is how we search for different things, or we can click our way through, or we can just type in and search for it. So the first event we need to worry about is the start event. This is what happens the very first time the character, this script runs. So when the character is initialized. So we're going to start event, and these are called units. So we have a unit of a start event. And you'll notice over here at the side, this is a little arrow, and that's where we'll drag to make the connection. And that's referred to as a node. So our units all have different nodes on them, and we just can grab those and drag it out, drag the node. When we do, the fuzzy finder will pop up, and we can search for the next unit to connect it to, or just right click to cancel out of it. So along with the start event, we also need to always worry about the update event. So the start is initialized, that runs one time at the very beginning, and then update will run every frame of the game. This is what happens over and over and over again. So every one of your scripts, you're going to want to make sure you have a start and an update unit. And this is taking a minute to search. Hopefully it's not going to take too long. Some of them go quicker than others. There it is. So we have update, which just runs at every frame. A late update, that sets it so that it's the very last thing that runs every frame of the game. And fixed update runs at a fixed time interval every time, no matter what else is going on in the game. We'll just use update for this simple example. But these two events we need to worry about every time, so make sure you always include those units, the start unit and the update unit.